My father was an art teacher and my mother was a music teacher, and that's the common thing that they had together was the sort of creative stuff, and that they were both teachers. And my mum was a beautiful singer, was involved with Ballarat Light Opera Company, and my dad would often do the backdrops as part of just his support for what was going on. And I guess that creative side of life is part of the melting pot that I grew up in, as well as a very pragmatic 1950s kind of suburban Wendouree in the growing lands, Ballarat. Yeah, I remember absolutely loving it. We would often have people from the theatre world would come to our house, and I remember in particular there was one show they were doing called La Belle Helene. It was directed by a guy called Neil Case, and they had a very limited budget, but I remember workshops at my place painting noodles to make gold jewellery, and kind of really literally slapping stuff together. It ended up looking extraordinary. And it was designed by Maureen Boone, who's an old Ballarat woman here, an old Ballarat artist here. And then loving that whole thing of when it would come to dress rehearsals, we kids would be left to roam around Her Majesty's Theatre, and part of our fun was simply picking up jaffas off the floor that had been left the night before, and finding lollies and having the best time. But there was also just this magical world that I absolutely adored. There'd be all this chaos going on with people sort of running all over the place, and then all of a sudden there'd be this whole thing of, all right, we're going to, run this particular scene, and then the orchestra would start doing their noisy sort of stuff, and then the curtain would go up, and then it was sort of watching my mum being, Helen of Troy, or watching my mum being Julie out of Carousel, or my mum being Laurie out of Oklahoma. And suddenly this whole thing of, you could have one life, and I knew what our daily 50s suburban world was, and it would transform with all this stuff in theatre, and sort of realising you could be a million people on the stage. You didn't just have to live this life that you were living, you could live any life. And watching that was a kind of a magical, engaging thing for a girl like me who had a vast imagination. So it was just, that set off all sorts of things in the way I played. I used to create my own versions of The King and I, and make neighbours and friends watch me on the front lawn and charge them tickets and stuff like that. So it was definitely part of the whole creative melting pot that was my childhood in suburban Ballarat. Yeah, I mean, at the age of 5, I was learning how to do ballet at Carol Oliver's School of Ballet, and she was a 16-year-old girl going to Ballarat High School at the time, and she and her sister Cheryl started this little ballet school in what is now, I think, the Performing Arts Centre in Wendouree, and I was one of the first class of students that they had. And in my mind, I was going to be the girl in the tutu. I didn't realise that you had to do all this other stuff to just be that, and the other stuff was a bit tedious, and it was called learning steps and whatever. And I guess that attitude continued for me all the way through, the dreariness of having to get the technique in order to get the tutu. I just wanted to jump straight to the tutu. And I do wonder if that's what set up this whole tendency of, well, ordinary people can also be part of the tutu world. You don't necessarily have to do too much tedium in order to create magic. I remember being painted at kind of an orangey brown in order that I might be a South Pacific Islander child, and having sprayed my blonde hair black in order to fit that picture, and going home at night and having to scrub this muck off in the bath before going to sleep and turning up at school the next day. But I loved it, and similar kind of journey as being a Siamese twin in The King and I. My mum was playing Anna, Fred Farger was playing the King, and I was a Siamese twin, and same thing, nuggeting up literally, and spraying your hair black in order to be part of this. But loved it, absolutely loved it. And, being on the stage at Her Madge at that age, and here's my mother as the leading lady, and somehow there was a reflected glory in that. And watching the transition of adults and children from in the wings, there they are doing their normal stuff, and then suddenly, ta-da, on the stage, the lights, everything. Yeah, that magical transition was just something I adored. Ballet became uncool for me at about the age of 12 when, suddenly it seemed kind of daggy to be going along to ballet class, so I left. Didn't do an awful lot until about the age of 15 when I re-engaged with lyric theatre and auditioned and became part of the chorus in The Boyfriend. Thought I was terribly grown up, going to rehearsals and going to the cafes afterwards, and absolutely loved it. And Wendy Widgery was, front and centre at that time, and then eventually, revisited a bit of drama at high school, but drama wasn't even a subject then. You had to do that as an elective. I just really wanted to be an actor. Thought I would audition for NIDA, but they wouldn't take anyone who was directly out of school in those days, and I think wisely. And my dad was pragmatic, and he said, look, if you're going to go into this whole thing of theatre, it's very ephemeral and it's very unreliable. You need a backup. So I'd prefer if you found something where there was something at the end of it that meant that you could actually get a job. Again, quite wise words in those days. So ended up having to choose whether to go to art school or whether to go to Rusden and do a degree in drama, which is what I chose to do. Yeah, I went to Rusden, auditioned, turned up there, and thinking it would be like Ballarat, right? And you would immediately, do all these stage shows and musicals like Ballarat. Well, not a bit of it. No. I turned up wide-eyed and naive, all of 18, to be met by people who were sort of going through the real 70s awakening. When we were having interviews of what subjects to enrol in, met by a woman called Bron Nichols, who was, rubbing my back and had wild hair and little cut-off shorts, and I'm there kind of feeling distinctly uncomfortable, thinking, I am really not in Kansas anymore. This is not kind of what I thought this was all going to be about. And then taking the ride of what was drama training in those days, which was marvellous actually, but it was 9 a.m. till 6 and more at night of contact hours. The first show I think I did in first year was a thing called Vagina Rex and the Gas Oven, and I remember my mum and dad turning up to that show, and you could see them my dad I think left at interval and went to listen to football, and I was appalled, thinking how uncouth. And my mother kind of going, right, now exactly what's taken all those hours to be able to do this thing? But, I think uni in those days was very much about unlearning and a whole lot of new ideas coming in. People were smoking dopes, people were, getting very political. That was all part of the melting pot of what it was to go to uni in the 70s. And we were really in the flows of the Whitlam government, which was, quite amazing and pro-arts, and the world seemed to be our oyster. We had scholarships, which, studentships, which paid you a little stipend to go and do this. Nowadays it's very, very different. User pays, but we actually got supported to do that. And if that wasn't the case, I wouldn't have been able to afford a tertiary education. So, I feel very fortunate about that. There was the Vietnam War and all that was on about. People were right into political activism at the time, and my naive upbringing got severely challenged by a whole lot of ideas and kind of intrigued by them at the same time. There were some lecturers at my uni who would start our drama practice doing Chairman Mao's exercises. The whole thing about communism was kind of really bubbling in Australia at that time. I wasn't particularly political, but I did get engaged in some of the protests that were on and found that all very exciting. And it was the rise of feminism and the rise of Germaine Greer and this whole world of what was possible for women was starting to change. And I was this rather odd mix of traditional, rather fluffy, bright-eyed, theatre-loving, fantasy-loving, fairyland kind of loving girl, right? With a reasonably strong intellect that got really engaged in some of the more serious aspects of life. And those two things remained quite a strange fit, and still do to some degree. Yeah. Well, it was so confusing to me, and I still to this day wonder at the value of it. It was very, very interesting. But does it actually make you a good performer? And I'm not sure. To me, there was a sense of, it was deeply intuitive in me. And I didn't understand why, when I was studying something of Shakespeare, why it would be valuable to go down to the beach, be told to sort of take your clothes off. I would have to, learn how to be Prospero, and somebody else would learn how to be Miranda, who was a man, and this whole thing was meant to be very experimental and breaking down conventions and whatever. And to me, it seemed an incredible toss. I'm there going, really? We were doing Shakespeare and we weren't to study the lines for the first 4 weeks. We weren't to even look at the script, And then, this is in its extreme state. Rusden was a marvellous place, but this was one production that was particularly, interesting, high-end approach. That performance ended up with the director being carted off to hospital with an asthma attack, many of the main actors going down ill, and this beautiful set that had been commissioned, we had to do it kind of reading books because half the cast was ill. So, how helpful, I'm not sure, but very interesting life experience.